what is your sense of the music, not your own sense, but the sense, like you said, the way 80s has a particular place in history versus the 90s? What did you find when you were compiling it?
I think the 90s was kind of 80s junior in a way,
Hmm.
because I do call it in that book, it was the last golden decade of the album. You know, is when we
Right.
bought albums, when we
Yeah.
consumed album, when they were water cooler, because there were still water coolers, when they were when they were water cooler discussion. And
Yeah.
so that new Pearl Jam album, that new Smashing Pumpkins album, the new Oasis album, or whatever, really got a lot of attention. But that was due to what happened in the 80s when you had all sorts of developments, when you had MTV, when you had, I mean, the Sony Walkman, the first Sony Walkman I saw was in 1979, and they became commonplace in the 80s with boom boxes and everything else. Suddenly you can have your music with you 24/7, and music, which we do now, but in a different way. You engaged with your Walkman differently than you engaged with
Yeah.
Spotify, much more actively and much more immersively. So music just became so much a part of your life. And during the
Yeah.
80s, constant. And then you watched it on TV. So you didn't have to watch the sitcom. You watched videos, and we all watched videos you say, yeah, I'm going to sit down for 20
Yeah.
minutes and watch a video. 5 hours later,
Yeah.
you might remember you haven't eaten. But the impact that had on the lifestyle impact that had on everybody was so tremendous, and so it was just there all the time.
Yeah.
And like I
Yeah.
say, the 90s I think benefited from that, and then it's a longer story, but we got away from that in the later 90s with streaming and Napster and P2P file sharing. But the 80s really was the 80s. I think they ask on the back of the book. I didn't write this, but the greatest music decade of all time? Question mark. Could make a pretty compelling argument there.